till. Men annars, välkomna hit. Så välkomnar vi Joakim Medin från Sverige, ganska nyligen hemkommen från Syrien och andra platser i Mellanöstern.
I'm very happy to be here in Helsinki and to have been invited to speak to you about this topic. A topic that was not so easy to talk about less than a year ago. The question of Rojava and the Kurds fighting to build a new society and also to fend off all people trying to attack this new society and the Kurdish areas of Rojava and other Kurdish areas for that part. But now many things have been happening in a very short time, and all of a sudden this topic became very internationally known, which made me very happy, and of course the Kurds very happy, and the other people living in Rojava. So I will try to make this as short and brief as possible for an hour. I spoke about this for 5 hours once in Gothenburg. So it's very easy to talk a lot about it. I will try to make it as short as possible. The previous picture that I showed that I can't show now because it's not JPEG. It shows the situation right now in Syria. And as you have heard, even though I can't show you a picture of it, the nation state of Syria is today totally dissolved, more or less. We have one part controlled by the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. Dr. Bashar, I was told his name was, in prison. You have one part controlled by Daesh, or the Islamic State, who announced their own caliphate last summer. They're controlling mainly the central and eastern part of Syria. You also have the 3 cantons of Rojava, where Kurds are the dominant population. And you also have a few other pockets of continued resistance by Jaish al-Hur, the so-called Free Syrian Army, which is no one army at all. It's actually many different small groups fighting for many different agendas. And some of them are not to be trusted, and some of them are still more or less Democrats. But they are continuously getting weaker and weaker. That's the situation right now in Syria, even though the fronts are always moving, and we saw Al-Qaeda capture Idlib, a major city, very recently. Al-Qaeda is known as Al-Nusra in Syria. The fronts are continuously changing, but we see more or less the same situation right now. This is the situation right now concerning the expansion of ISIS, or IS, or ISIL, as Obama says, or Daesh, as you say in Arabic and other languages, also Kurdish. This is the expansion of the caliphate of Daesh, more or less also now. And this has been the focus of a lot of international attention since June last year, when Daesh started their very major military campaign to try to push away any resistance lying both in Iraq and Syria and in the Kurdish areas, both of Iraq and Syria. That has brought a lot of international attention. And they look like this, as you all know. I started covering the development of and in Syria, looking at the refugees leaving Syria into the neighboring countries. But I also got interested step by step to actually go into Syria. When I noticed how there were a few actors in this conflict and situation that weren't getting enough attention, or hardly any attention at all. Specifically the Kurds, and the people the Kurds were fighting were not getting any significant attention either. And I will get back to this later, but that's one of the main reasons why I got involved in this. And that has brought me to a lot of interesting discoveries and situations where I, at some points, have been the only Western journalist to cover a few atrocities and developments of this area. And here's one of them that was described in the event description of this event. The attack on the Kurdish city of Shingal in August last year. Shingal is in northern Iraq, bordering South Kurdistan and Syria. Specifically where one of the cantons of Rojava is now established. And how many of you remember this thing? What happened? Yeah, a few of you. It got a lot of international attention because the media outlets hadn't really focused on this situation before. What happened was in early August last year, the forces of ISIS or Daesh, having expanded drastically both in Syria and Iraq, encircled the city of Shingal, where a Kurdish religious minority called the Yazidis are living. They are not Christians or Muslims or Jews. They are not people of the Old Testament, which made them perfectly fine to kill, to try to exterminate, according to ISIS. So they attacked and took this city. And the Kurdish forces of South Kurdistan, the Peshmerga protecting this city, left very hastily, we can say. So the people were more or less defenseless in this military situation. They were chased up to this mountain, also called Shingal, the holy mountain of Shingal. And in early August, this was a very hot and dry place. It was about 45 degrees still. There's not really any shadow on this mountain, and there's very few sources of water, of course. There's very few wells. There was no food, of course, to try to feed a few tens of thousands of hungry people. So many people started to die very quickly. And in this situation, the Kurdish forces of Rojava started this international rescue mission, where they left Rojava, crossed the Iraqi-Syrian border, and reached the mountain. And they were able to salvage all these people, to create this corridor, so the people could be rescued from the foot of the mountain, basically, into Rojava. And I was there to witness this happening. This is a photo from very close to the border, where all the Yazidis were arriving into Rojava, having crossed the Iraqi-Syrian border. In these very, very big convoys, you can see, even Volvo trucks. About 3,000 people in each convoy, and there were 3 convoys every day. So around 10,000 people arrived every day for about 4 days. And these are some of the scenes. I took a few hundred pictures on these days. So did my Danish photographer. So these are some of the scenes happening at this point, where the survivors, because many people did not survive this genocide, where the survivors showed up in these cars, trucks, all kinds of vehicles, basically, screaming desperately for anything to drink and anything to eat. Because some of them got something to drink during these days, because obviously they survived the whole week, otherwise they would not have survived at all. But many of them had no food for a whole week, so they were desperate to eat something. And because this is a region under heavy embargo, where the people themselves are you can't really be that spontaneous in the kitchen, because you don't have the same goods as before. So they were mainly just simple food and water and biscuits to give them. That was the only thing available at this point. And this is the worst thing I've seen in my entire life. Much worse than seeing any dead people or being imprisoned in Syria. There was nothing compared to this, seeing people actually dying almost. Much worse. This is the second of 3 major attempts of genocide that or ethnic cleansing caused by the Islamic State, Daesh. The first ones, I also have pictures of that, but it's sort of out of context, even though it isn't actually. The first attempt was when they expelled all the Christian Assyrians from Mosul, Iraq's second biggest city. And all the Christian inhabitants got 24 hours to either leave Mosul forever, where they had stayed for 1,600 years, or they will all die. So they had to leave. And I also went to see them when they actually arrived into South Kurdistan. And it's also, of course, ethnic, religious cleansing of an entire nation. The third attempt of ethnic cleansing, of capturing a piece of land and cleansing it of its ethnic religious inhabitants, were against this area, the area of Kobani, which is in the central north of Syria, and is one of the 3 cantons, Kurdish cantons in Syria. It was not attacked for the first time when the international media started writing about it. Of course not. It had been under attack by extremists, by religious fanatics, and even by the Free Syrian Army, certain factions within it, since late 2012. But the world media started writing about this only when ISIS finally showed up for a big assault. They did not write about it when they attacked Kobani with chemical weapons a few months before this. No one wrote about it. But this was in the middle of September when ISIS attacked Kobani with a very large supply of heavy weapons and Soviet tanks and American Humvees, like Panzer cars, that they captured from Mosul and from Syrian army barracks. So they had a lot of really more heavy weapons than before. And they attacked the countryside and the villages around Kobani, and because the defense forces of Kobani do not have the same weapons, of course, they were gradually pushed back towards the city. And I arrived to Kobani, I don't even remember, I think it was the 22nd or 3rd September, 23rd September, I think. I went there really fast to join the protests. They were gathering thousands of people on this side of the border, in North Kurdistan or Turkey, with thousands of Kurds and actually other people. I also met Christian Assyrians and Kurds, Turks, who wanted to cross the border to reach the city, to help the city try to fight off the extremists of ISIS. But the Turks refused them to actually enter the city. I managed to, in a very clandestine and illegal way. And I reached the city when it was attacked on 3 sides, and the 4th side was militarized and closed. Yeah, it was. I ran across a minefield to get in. I simply jumped over the fence with some Kurdish activists who wanted to fight, and we ran across a minefield. And there was no mines this specific path, because obviously someone knew the way. So I was happy because we reached the city unharmed.
And the police has shot people.
For sure. They killed their own citizens trying to join the fight in Kobani. I knew I would need another hour for sure to talk about this, but As most of you know, I hope, there is a very long and infected conflict between the Kurds and the Turkish state, having refused the Kurds their own identity and democratical cultural rights for 100 years now. So there's a very, very old and big conflict between the Kurdish strive for cultural freedom, to say I am a Kurd, and to have your rights to do it, and the policy of the Turkish state. So they would not allow, most analysts say that they would not allow any help for this city because they simply wanted it to lose. And why? I will get back to this, I promise you. So in this city, the defense forces made up of the local population were inevitably pushed back day by day. Every day, 24 hours a day, you could hear, I could see, I was living next to the main road on top of a house on the roof. I could see cars going back and to the front all the time with wounded people or sometimes dead people. People who got martyred in the defense of the city. The city itself got shelled by ISIS because they came to the city with a lot of heavy artillery and grenades that they continuously rained upon the city. So there was a lot of destroyed buildings where people lived, of course, and they got these bombs inside their living rooms. So there were many burials at this point, and this is where I actually helped to bury a young man in this grave, who he got a bomb straight in on his head actually, when he was on the patch of land between the city and the border to where the Turkish army were at. So he lost his head, and his family showed me this, of course, because they wanted me to tell the world, because at this point I was the last international journalist still in the city, because we were very few from the beginning, because we couldn't enter the city from the Turkish side. And gradually all the others left, but I stayed on for a few days. So this man, he was the older brother of the man who was getting buried in the grave. And he tore his shirt open, and he said that you have to bury me instead, because I refused to have my younger brother buried in this hole in the ground, which wasn't the actual burial ground. Actually, this was on a dirty backyard, because ISIS were raining bombs on the place where you normally bury people in the city. And this is Kobani today. These are pictures when I came back to the city, again illegally, because we could not enter legally. The Turkish army shot at me and the other Kurds crossing the border at nighttime. And most of the city looks like this today. Not all of it. Some parts have been salvaged because the Kurdish defense forces managed to hold on to a section of the city that it didn't actually lose, because they didn't lose the city. But the other part looks like this now, mainly. This is the house where I lived in September and until early October. And now it looks like this because a suicide truck came from Daesh. All witnesses actually say it came from the only open road, which is from the Turkish side. And it crossed through the border gate here, and it stopped here, right outside the bedroom where I was living on rainy nights. Otherwise, I was living on the floor, on the roof, and it blew up itself. And the whole structure came down almost like this. Moving on. The local defense forces, YPG, or the People's Protection Units, managed to actually hold on to a piece of the city and gradually managed to push away ISIS. From the early days of October, until late January, when we actually saw Kobani liberated again. What was left of the city was now liberated. And now things are actually back to normal, if you can even say that, because all of the countryside once captured by ISIS is now back in Kurdish hands again. And very few people, except for the people believing in Kurds, could see this happening. Most people from President Erdogan in Turkey to the White House to many people were actually predicting the city to fall rapidly. Not because they were anti-Kurdish maybe, except for Erdogan, but you could actually, people expected this city to be like all other cities in Syria, to simply collapse from the pressure of anyone attacking it, and that will be the end of it. But instead, this has been called Kobanigrad or Stalingrad, because this was the moment where the unstoppable campaign of ISIS actually reached its end, where we saw that they were not at all unstoppable. You were able to prevent their expansion simply through will and some firepower, of course, because that's what they use. As you can see, it wasn't much that they used on the ground. You have these old Soviet rocket launchers made out of metal and wood. You got Kalashnikovs, and you even got the shotguns to use against tanks and against armored vehicles and against heavy machine guns. A very unjust fight, even though the Americans were also in the air from time to time. But this produced a lot of victims, of course, and a lot of destruction. But the motivation behind this, and here are the defense forces, very young people, as you see, young local people. More photos of the destruction. And when they captured some of the weapons from Daesh, and one of their notorious flags also, and American painkillers. And I also found a big bag of cocaine, me and the Kurdish forces this day. What is motivating this struggle? We have to look beyond the simple question of defending the land or the homes or protecting lives. Most people sought to analyze the struggle by saying that the people are fighting for their lives, and that's not true completely. Of course, people want to survive, but if this was a question of surviving, then all of the people in Kobani could simply cross the border a few hundred meters away into Turkey, and they could be safe. Not free maybe, but they could at least spare their lives in refugee camps in Turkey. Instead, all of the defense forces stayed in the city. They fought over every house and every street in the city. And the refugees actually sent their daughters and their sons back to the war to fight for the city. And why is this? That's when a lot of history and politics and revolution comes into the picture, that you have to also bring into the picture to understand it. And it starts with something called Kurdistan, which is something that is apparently still not known to all people, despite the fact that it's very connected to European politics and European intervention in the Middle East. Kurdistan is this geographical region in the Middle East, spanning over several countries, as we see, where somewhere around 30 million people live that are all Kurds and speak dialects of the same language, share the same culture, share the same traditions, and so on and so on. A people, simply. Having been divided, despite the fact that they populate this huge area, they were divided almost 100 years ago because the French and the English didn't think that they deserved their own country. When they invented the modern borders of the Middle East, they created Iraq and Syria and the borders of the modern state of Turkey, despite the fact that there were no such thing before called Syria, and that these new borders cut completely through the landscape and through families and everything, where people hadn't had any borders before. So the Kurds were divided into these new nation states, which had artificial nation states. In 2000, this is an old map, but it shows more or less the reality now also. In 2012, in the summer, the civil war in Syria had been raging for a bit over 1 year. And the forces of the Assad regime were weakened by this civil war. So in July 2012, they decided to pull back almost all of their military forces from the Kurdish areas, in these 3 areas, in northern Syria, to use these military forces against rebels and extremists and all kinds of people attacking them, because the Kurds were not attacking them. They wanted also democracy and a revolution and political rights, not least of all. But they didn't want to use force by the same way as the Arab rebels of Syria. What happened then was that the Kurdish progressive movement called Tevdem quickly seized power from the regime once the military forces were gone. Because Tevdem had organized this underground political structure already, simply waiting for the moment to use this, to do something better of the Kurdish regions and in the long run of all of Syria. And they succeeded in this. And in January 2014, 1 year and 3 months ago almost, the same progressive movement, together with the allied forces of other ethnic and religious groups, also declared their own autonomy. In these 3 cantons, based or inspired a little bit by the Swiss model of having cantons. And these 3 cantons are united by under the name of Rojava. But they are called Afrin, Kobani, and Jazira. And this is the political model of autonomy. And there's a lot of, I can speak a lot about this, obviously, but just a few examples of what I've been able to see when I've been visiting these regions, the cantons a few times, is that people speak about a revolution in Rojava, but actually, and there's also a name of the chapter in this book that I sell for 15 euros, commercial. It's in Swedish, sadly, not in English, but a few of them you can read it, I hope. This chapter I call The Revolution in Rojava, but actually it's I came to realize that it was a stupid title, because there's actually several revolutions in one. For example, it's a cultural revolution. The Kurds have been oppressed, not only politically, but also ethnically, in their respective nation states for 100 years now. The regimes in these countries have been telling them that you are not Kurds at all. You might be Kurds, but you have to assimilate to become the dominating ethnic group instead. In Turkey, the Kurds were forbidden to speak or write in their own language, and they were called Mountain Turks for a very long time, and denied any cultural democratic rights, and they still are, even if things got slightly better in the last years. In Syria, it was the same thing, but there the Kurds weren't supposed to be Turks, but instead they were supposed to be Arabs. So same as in Turkey, the regime came up with new names for the villages where people lived. So they erased all the Kurdish names of villages and cities and renamed them to something Turkish or something Arabic in this case, in Syria. And people have been denied to speak Kurdish publicly, to write in Kurdish publicly, and so on and so on. They've been denied to celebrate the Kurdish New Year. So they've been oppressed to show their cultural identity this way. Now when you go on the countryside in Rojava, you can see how people sometimes put their own road signs on the side of the road, pointing with an arrow to this village. And it isn't something in Arabic, it's written in Kurdish instead. Many times also using Latin letters because they refuse to be Arabicized. What do you call it? Arabization. I don't know if there's a verb for it. Or sometimes actually people, I also got photos of it, where people simply crossed over the Arabic name and wrote the Kurdish one instead with spray paint to make it easier. Because there's an original name for the village or the city actually. So what happened now in the schools, for example, the kids are being taught Kurdish in the elementary school. You also have education in the Kurdish language, Kurmanji, the northern dialect, for all adults also. So there's this mass education taking place, and people can show openly and free that you can have a T-shirt that says I'm Kurdish on it, or Kurdistan. And if you had this before, I met people who actually went to prison or lost their jobs because of this, because they show that I'm Kurdish. Now you can name your children something Kurdish. If you did that before, you went to prison if you were unlucky. So a culture revolution. Many Kurds were also denied citizenship in Syria. Actually, this even broke the Syrian law, because the Syrian law clearly states if you live for this and this long in Syria, you become a Syrian citizen, like in Finland, like in Sweden, like everywhere. But this was denied, this right was denied the Kurds. So they lived there for hundreds of thousands of Kurds eventually lost their citizenship in 1963, and they didn't get it back. Neither did their children or their grandchildren. So they were stateless in the country where they were born and lived their whole life sometimes. Completely insane, of course. You can see a lot of local initiatives to keep society together, to not give in to the pressure of migration or acceptance of the regime or nothing at all. In this situation, more than 4 years now of civil war and conflict in Syria, of course, a lot of the local economy and the production of goods and markets and all of this collapsed. So people have been unable to find the products that they need to keep society going. Instead of simply giving in, there's been a range of these cooperatives established and other solutions also, but this is just one example. And there's a happy girl also in front of it. In this cooperative, they were producing their own electric cables with this very interesting machine. This is in a part of Kamishlu, the central city in Yazira Canton, neighborhood of Hilalia. And it wasn't the best quality, of course, but they could use it instead of simply accepting that there's no more electric cables and we need this to keep society going, because sometimes we actually do have electricity. Across the street there was also a factory producing sweets and candy, and I ate it and it wasn't very good at all, but people were still buying this on the local markets, and it gave 11 people jobs, only one of them a man. So the society found solutions this way to keep the society going, producing even candy not tasting so good, because people also need these daily products to not be angry and be satisfied with life. There was also a cooperative making snacks and nuts, because it's also very important in the Kurdish context to have snacks. There was also initiatives like this to keep education going, this mass education also. This is something called Mesopotamia Academia, the Mesopotamian Academy in English. This is a building confiscated from the regime's Ministry of Agriculture. So they crushed the propaganda signs on the outside and simply took over the building and transformed it into a locally run, grassroots controlled university, you can call it, where they teach history, sociology, and law, and they have plans to expand it also. For several reasons: to keep education going, to find a meaningful solution for the young generation who wants to study, or maybe almost completed their studies before the war, or something like this. Also to educate the people of their own history that has been denied them. And finally, this political development also resulted in a new political system and administration. And there's much to say about this, but I will show it with just a few examples. This is a photo from July last year, when there's a session in the parliament in the largest canton, Yazira. So this is the parliament, the canton parliament. Where they were discussing a new law to establish, what was it? Mandatory military service to be able to fight the ISIS and other people attacking them. And there was some debates, not everyone agreed to this, and there was a man pointing his finger like this and screaming. He was not happy at all. But people explained this is a good thing, because if you pointed like this before at someone sitting behind a desk on a stage, you would go to prison, or you would simply disappear. But now it's able to show your critique this way. So it's a good thing with angry people. This session was led by a woman. So she was a woman to start with in a region we think is only controlled by men. That's the way it always will be in the conservative Middle East. That's our image of it, I mean. She was also not Kurdish. She's actually a Christian Assyrian. And she was leading the session this day. So this actually flips around a lot of the images that most people in this part of the world has of the Middle East. That there are Christians living there. That women can be in some sort of control in society. That people can control them, cooperate instead of killing each other, according to ethnic or religious division. We see something different happening here, despite the fact that it's been attacked by the worst form of extremism. This political system is about cooperation of the ethnic and religious peoples in this canton, which is the most multicultural one, to keep society intact, but also to make it evolve into something better and more democratic this way. You can also see this in the protection of the areas. This is a photo of a local farmer called Mr. Harib, organized in the police force called Sotoro. But he's not Kurdish, he's also a Christian Assyrian. And he was sharing a checkpoint together with Kurdish forces on the countryside. You also have something as exotic as an all-female police force guarding the streets and arresting naughty people, called Asajian. And this is one of the last photos that I took before disappearing a week. But I managed to save these photos successfully. And these women, not so much maybe the local police, but the Kurdish female guerrilla fighters have been getting a lot of international attention from since the point when Kobani was attacked by ISIS, from the late days of September last year. This is these ones are called, they are organized in something called YPG, which means the Women's Protection Units. All female guerrilla forces protecting these cantons. And these two soldiers are called Rawan and Sarildan. These are code names, not their real names. And I met them outside of Kobani in the last day of September, I think. They were on the eastern front outside of Kobani. Extremely young, both of them. And when I went back to Kobani in December, I managed to track down this girl again, Sarildan, the one to the right here. I was looking for half a week to try to find her because at that point the whole city was ruined basically. So I brought a magazine, this one, a Swedish magazine, where I published a picture of Sarildan, and I showed it to the commanders, the military commanders of Kobani, and I explained this is the highest priority. This is more important than fighting ISIS right now. To find this girl, to try to show the continuancy of the defense and fight for Kobani, and how, or try to find it, to show how a teenage girl is still fighting these extremists after over 3 months. And I managed to find her after half a week on the first line on the southern front, which was then inside the city. And she was in this outpost, just maybe I think 200 meters from ISIS, in a bombed out house. It was these huge holes in the walls and so on. And I interviewed her, and we hugged and all of this, and took photos of each other, selfies, everything. And she was extremely happy to get a copy of the magazine where there was a picture of her. So at first she seemed like, oh, this is not a big deal. But then she was actually showing all the people, like, look at this, it's me. Apparently some other journalists later came and she also showed them, look at this is me in the magazine. She was very happy. But something that made me very sad was the fact that she was a brilliant example of how these people, in December, they were known in the entire world. The brave women of Kobani fighting against these monsters in ISIS. And the whole world was saluting them and as a glorious example of powerful women and feminism. And these are truly remarkable people. But did they get any help at all? No, they did not. And very few people actually criticized this or highlighted this until recently. If you look at this picture and this picture, we see that she's having the exact same rifle. 100 days later, almost exactly 100 days later. It's the same rifle and the same strap. And she was at the very front of a war in a city that the whole world was following and saluting and telling the whole world how brave these people are. But they were not helped by the one thing that you need fighting in street battling. I mean, weapons, of course. And only 2 weeks after the list of martyrs having fallen in this battle was updated, and her picture was on it. So she also fell in Kobani. And I cried my eyes out when I saw these news. This was in the middle of January, so about 20 days after we said goodbye. And I told her that I will be back in the spring to Kobani, and you have to be safe and all this, so I'll see you again. And she responded in a strange way, but I got it later, because she didn't say I will be here. She said we will be here, because she already accepted the fact that she might die tomorrow. It took 20 days instead of 1 day. But she also fell because of the lack of help from the outside, military that is. I mean, there's been now a lot of solidarity coming from the outside. But military help we have seen none, almost at all. So a lot of people in this entire generation is gone in this city. And this was the same days, Christmas last year, that news reached us that the Czech Republic had, I don't know if they sold them or simply donated, but anyway, 5,000 armor-piercing rockets arrived to the Kurdish forces of South Kurdistan. I don't know if they bought them or it was simply a gift for Christmas, but 5,000 rockets arrived to them, while these forces got nothing, and they were fighting the same enemy. So why is that? And it's very political, of course. And we can discuss this if you have any questions about it. But a critical question is, how come that these fighters, the female guerrilla soldiers, having now received this worldwide attention, and the enemies they are fighting, ISIS, everyone knows about this now, or many people at least in the entire world. How come that they didn't get any attention at all only 1 year ago? It's like they suddenly just appeared out of nowhere. But of course that isn't true at all. About this time of the year, 1 year ago, I was on the streets of Stockholm with some Kurdish activists, desperately trying to hand out leaflets to people passing by, trying to inform them that there are Kurds living in Syria, and we've established this new system. It's very interesting. We have these really, really cool female fighters, and they're fighting this horrible enemy called ISIS that you have to acknowledge, and you have to write about this. They're a big threat to a lot of people in the Middle East, and no one cared about these people. And no one cared to write about ISIS either. Because it is almost like, of course there were some articles written a few times, or maybe in alternative papers, these people were brought up. They recognized these people. But a lot of time it was like it was too difficult to look at more than one thing at a time. Because a year ago we only knew about this Free Syrian Army and the Assad regime. They were fighting. It was too complicated to look at any more actors in this situation. Too complicated for our tiny little minds. So these people got very little or sometimes no attention at all. And the point that I always stress is that we must see this as a failure. This is a failure of the so-called mass communication society that we think that we live in. When this conflict that has received so much attention, the biggest refugee situation since the Second World War, when we are able to miss these extremely important perspectives completely. In in countries where most people have a smartphone, where everyone's got internet. We missed all this, more or less. It's a failure also of our media and of society to miss this. And I will stop there. Thank you.